What up, y'all? In this video, we're going to explore a definition of deep learning. This is an extension of the last video we did for how do we define learning. We're going to go deeper into that. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to find a resource to explore more on this. Let's go to appliedlinearalgebra.com. This is a website that I have been building for the last 8 years, I think. If you go over to blog, this will lead you to a place where you have a right menu here. And then if you go down to TLC, TLC represents the idea of the learning code. It's a project that I'm working on with some former students of mine. Here are a number of blog posts that I've written recently. If we go down to what is deep learning, that was published on the 24th day of January of last year of 2021. We already spoke through, click on that. This is a podcast representation, so it's just me narrating the blog post for those of you that don't necessarily want to read. We have already done a previous video on the definition of learning, and we said we defined learning as a growth process that happens inside your body and leads to changes in your knowledge, beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes. These come from your experiences and increase your performance, increase your potential for improved performance and future learning. And we broke that down into a bunch of steps. And I want to go on and actually extend that to a definition of deep learning. This is, I find, really powerful. The goal of all of this work is to help you create a model for how learning works in your brain, and also vocabulary and a really nuanced sense of what it means to learn, so that as you're engaging in your classes, you can make informed decisions on what the best type of learning and type of practice you need at any given moment. So with that, I'm going to encourage, what I always like to say is my job is to encourage the deepest learning that I can encourage in my class. And that's in kind of contrast to what we call shallow learning. So one of the things that's really hard about teaching is I can't see inside my students' brains. And when I define a task, for some students, that task might be way too hard. For some students, that task might be way too easy. And there's a whole group of students that task might be exactly right where what they need at that moment. But the best judges of the difficulty level of a task is the student themselves. And we don't actually give what I would call good vocabulary to allow students to describe this. And we use these systems of domination and control. Teachers force all students to do the same thing, as if education is a process by which we turn the crank. So one of the things that we're doing here is we're recapturing our own agency over the learning process by being able to develop language to describe what we're doing. And then hopefully in the next few videos, we're going to transition that language into a model that we can use to actually assess the difficulty level of certain tasks. And that might allow us to better guide our own learning. And if we're faced with an authority figure who is doing something that might actually be blocking our learning, we can then use that language to describe to that person ways that they might improve their service to us in honor of our learning. So with that said, let's go ahead and read our definition. What is deep learning? So we're going to define this as a noun, and we say that we define deep learning to be learning that involves an intense, distraction-free focus on growing your abilities by pushing beyond the limits of your current capacity. So intense, distraction-free focus of growing your abilities by pushing past your current limits. When you engage in deep learning, you actively reach and repeat skills that you want to build by paying extra special attention to your performance during each repetition. I did want to call out, one of the things that I'm trying to do in all these videos is not only give you ideas about how to improve as a learner, but also resources that you might use if you want to learn more. And specifically, this concept of deep learning comes from a few different resources. Daniel Coyle, this author, wrote this book called The Little Book of Talent. It's a beautiful book. It's all about tips to build your brain faster and better. He also wrote a book called The Talent Code, which is kind of the science of developing skill. And then there's also this book by Jeff Cloven, which is Talent is Overrated. all three of these books lead to a simple idea, which is world-class performance is not something that is innate, it's something that is built. Not only can we build top-class performance, there are specific activities that do it faster and more effective. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that using this, you can read these, they're beautiful, beautiful books on that subject. But what I think is I'm going to abstract away from talent creation, because talent is very much embedded into this idea of hierarchy, meritocracy, right? And I want to abstract into the idea of learning, which is, I think that great talents come from deep learning. So I like to say, if we can focus on learning, then we can apply those skills into any field and then develop talents from that. So I'm a little abstract away from the idea of just building talent and thinking about learning as the foundation upon which talent is created. So with that, we're thinking about deep learning involving intense, distraction-free focus on growing your abilities by pushing past your current capacity. And you're actively reaching and repeating over and over and over, paying very special attention. So this is a mentally taxing process. It's very similar to exercise. So I want to focus on two distinct features of this. And the first one is that deep learning requires you to seek a feeling of heightened struggle as you reach towards a goal that is on the outer edge of your current abilities. In other words, deep learning is mentally taxing. To learn deeply, you must exert conscious effort to push past yourself into a space where you make frequent mistakes. So this requires that you actively reflect on each attempt, and you have to be careful not to push too far, because if you push too far, you might not actually be able to figure out what went wrong, right? So the idea is that it's focused, really reflective practice where you're failing and iterating. And the way to kind of think about this is that, you know, if you're able to do something correctly between like 40% of the time and 80% of the time, that means that you're probably in the deep learning phase. We'll talk about that again in a future video. If you're over 80% of the phase, over 80% of success ratio, it's too easy. The task is probably too easy. You already got it. It's not at the outer edge of your capacity. And if you're failing more than 40% of the time, so you're successful 30% of the time or successful 20% of the time, the task is probably too hard because your iterations are just out of luck, right? They're not out of skill. You're not able to figure out what you're doing right or wrong. You're just getting it lucky every once in a while and then moving on. So what's really interesting about this is that when we're thinking about this idea that you're really having to push past your limits and enter a type of heightened struggle, in those moments, we're actually creating new neural networks that encode the knowledge or skill we want to build, and we're doing it for the first time. And this is a really intense process because we're creating new interconnectivities at that moment. And those connectivities are what is encoding the skill in our brain. So that's kind of what we're looking for. We're looking for heightened struggle, where as we're doing that, our brain is activating cells that haven't been activated before, or connecting those cells together and really struggling to do that. And then, so the first thing is that we're looking for a feeling of heightened struggle. And then the second thing is that we're focused on active and observant repetition. So not only are we trying to develop new skills or new knowledge, but we're also working to build mastery over that so that we can leverage that knowledge progressively into our future. And, we're going to talk about in a bit, we're going to talk about stages of deep learning. Another type of deep learning. So one type of deep learning is really struggling and making mistakes so that you can learn something for the first time. Another type of deep learning is once you understand how to do it for the first time, to repeat it so that you can do it more successfully with less effort. That second type of deep learning is designed to strengthen a nascent neural network. So, think about the first type as building connectivity between brain cells. And the second type is once those connections have been made, strengthen those connections so that the firing happens quicker. So myelinating the nerve. So there's kind of two different types of deep learning, both of which happen via intense focus. One of which is create a new network that encodes a skill by intense struggle, making mistakes and really working on it. And then the second type is mastery based, which is you've already done the skill for the first time. And what you're going to do is strengthen those interconnectivities, the cell connectivities, by myelinating those nerve cells. And what that means is take a skill that you've built for the first time, but you're not great at, practice it over and over again via intense repetition and really reflection, and make those skills better, right? The thing that I'll say in both of those is that it's an active process. I've heard, there's another book we'll talk about later that says that doing deep learning for more than 4 hours a day is almost impossible. We have like this upper limit of capacity. And so the idea here is that, you know, when you're doing this type of thing, this is an intense process that you can't do a lot of in a given day, right? So if it's too easy, it's probably not deep learning. Okay, so now that we have our definition of deep learning, I want to contrast that with a definition of what I call shallow learning. So deep learning involves intense distraction-free focus on growing your abilities and pushing beyond your limits. Okay, shallow learning, this is also a definition, and we're going to contrast that with deep learning. Shallow learning is the opposite of deep learning. Shallow learning involves a modest level of focus or lacks the intensity and duration required for deep learning. When you learn in a shallow way, you probably don't have a clear vision for how or why the learning that you're doing is important to you. You may also be unwilling or unable to leave your current comfort zone, which we'll talk about in a bit, to reach your goals on the outer edge of your ability. So shallow learning involves a distaste for mistakes and a desire to avoid making or identifying errors. So there's a few different things. It doesn't involve intensity. It's not an intense type of learning. It's not distraction-free. So you might be doing other stuff while you're doing this type of learning. And then you might not have a vision for how the learning relates to you, which is why you're not investing the extra effort. And also shallow learning, you avoid mistakes. One of the things that really bothers me about our education system, and this is why we're doing this, is the grading systems in most of your classes punish mistakes, which impose an emotional cost for the mistake-bearing process, which incentivize students to avoid mistakes. So one of the things that really bothers me about grading is grades incentivize via fear-based motivation shallow learning, right? When's the last time you messed up on a test and your teacher's like, oh my God, you messed up, an extra 10 point for you. Hey, Smedley over there, you got the right answer, minus 10 points because you didn't make any mistakes, right? That's not how grading works. And yet in really, really good learning, we should be incentivized to make mistakes. This is why I think grades are stupid. They're mechanisms of domination and control, not mechanisms to inspire really good learning processes. Okay, so in shallow learning, I want to focus on a few different parts of this definition. So shallow learning is marked by the absence of a conscious effort to engross yourself in intense focus on hard tasks. So the idea is that you're not focused on doing hard things, right? You're kind of doing it flippantly. Shallow learning also involves completing a task that you don't feel strongly about. So if you're doing something that you're not really excited about and you're not interested in, you're probably not going to invest the type of energy that it requires to be uncomfortable. In other words, you're going to be stuck in the shallow learning process. And then finally, shallow learning involves using strategies that do not support deep learning and thus slow the speed for your development and creation of new knowledge, right? So the idea of shallow learning is not to push yourself very hard. And so the skills that you use to do shallow learning are the opposite of what you would do here. So those are our definitions of shallow and deep learning. I have some, at the end of all of my blog posts, I have some reflection questions. So there's some strategies here. We'll talk about those again later in this playlist, but there's some reflection questions for you. And these are actually based on good learning principles. So one of the best ways to kind of solidify new knowledge is to test yourself without looking at the previous stuff and then get it wrong. That's deep learning. So here's a challenge to all of you. Please shut off your notes. Don't look at your notes. Shut off the videos. Please define for yourself what is learning. So what was our definition of learning? What's our definition of deep learning? What's our definition of shallow learning? Write those down. Then before you actually figure out whether or not you got it right, go back to the definitions, check all the mistakes, mark them, and try it again. That is a deep learning technique because you're actively forcing yourself to remember. right? Here's a second community challenge for you. When do you find that you're most likely to try hard things and make mistakes? What type of circumstances do you need in your life? And that's exactly what I'm asking in that blog post here. Go back here. I close it. What a goofball. Yeah, there we go. Describe what it feels like when you learn in a shallow way. When do you tend to engage in shallow learning? What factors in your life and what type of classroom policies tend to make you focus on shallow learning rather than deep learning? I can tell you right now, time tests make me want to learn shallow live in class. Constrictions, can't talk with your fellow learners, you can't look at books, you like all these things where I'm supposed to memorize stuff and do it live without any resources. That doesn't really help me make connections and make mistakes. That forces me to try to like confine myself to really limited types of thinking. And that's the type of policies that most of my teachers used in classrooms. So I can tell you that oftentimes my deepest learning were in spite of my teachers, not because of them. Most policies that I experienced in my undergraduate and graduate career that my teachers implemented actually blocked me from doing deep learning. Now, I have a lot to say about strategic deep learning, which is setting ourselves up strategically to thrive in classes and satisfy our teacher's requirement in the minimum amount of time so that I can clear my path to doing deep learning in my own time. Super frustrating. But I can say that just thinking about that. And then so describe what it feels like for you to engage in deep learning. What type of subject and topics do you already do deep learning in? And then, of course, I would actually say, like, when are you incentivized? When do you feel excited about transitioning away from shallow learning into deep learning? My answer to that question personally is I get excited about doing deep learning when it's related to something that I'm very interested in my life, something that positively impacts my family, that positively impacts my life, that puts more control into my hands, that makes people around me stronger. Those are all things that get me excited about really developing my skills in an area, or something that just literally brings me fun. So challenge for you all is to look through these community challenges and reflect on the definitions of deep learning and start to develop your identity as a deep learner. Let me say this. The videos that we're doing here are a way to encapsulate data, but the real learning happens after you watch these videos and engage in those activities. The idea here is to develop your identity as a learner and start to really develop a nuanced sense of what it is that you want to do with your learning and how to do it, right? Okay, so we'll pause on that. We'll come back. The goal of this particular set of videos is to start to develop a model for what deep learning is and what type of strategies support deep learning. Thanks so much for your attention, y'all. In the next video, we'll look at a strategy for identifying when you're engaged in deep learning. See you there.